I guess we'll get started here. Thanks for joining us. And Tom, I don't know if you want to leave for sure, because you could probably just do this one after you did the accounting bit. Who knew that Tom was also a CPA? My name is Brian Reilly with Ehlers. Sean will be picking up here as well. Just to give you a little sense of, Tom gave us a little introduction there at the beginning of the seminar, but Ehlers is an independent financial advisory firm. We've actually been in business for about 60 years. We're headquartered out of Roseville, Minnesota. We serve the western half of the state out of that office. And we also have an office in Brookfield, service the other part of Wisconsin out of that. But primarily our areas of operation are Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. From our perspective as an independent advisor, we're not a bank. We're not a broker-dealer or a securities firm. We give advice only. And I think that'll kind of be a theme as we walk through what we have here in our presentation. Since this is a legal seminar, we did feel compelled to offer a bit of legal discussion on some new undertakings in the public finance realm. Being a financial services firm, you'd probably think that we were regulated in some fashion. We had not been for a very long time. We were just fine with that, of course. It didn't change our behavior any. But we have fallen under the scope of the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, I believe it's referred to, but it's really called the Dodd-Frank Law, which I would imagine most of you have heard about. It's voluminous in nature, but what we wanted to do is just kind of tell all of you how it affects you from the standpoint of being a potential issuer of debt. All right, so again, from our perspective as independent advisors, our interests are aligned with yours. There are others out there that maybe didn't always serve that function, maybe self-serving in some regard or another. So what this really did was turn the page a little bit to amplify the message that we've been sending for many years and really codify it in some sense. So I want to walk you through a few things here. Please stop at any time. Well, then we'll transition to talking about financing capital projects kind of in today's environment. And then at the end, given where we're at in the interest rate cycle, we've been doing a ton of refinancing. For those of you that do have debt, maybe something you want to think about as well. So we'll move on to the second slide in the presentation here. But really, why should any of you care about Dodd-Frank as a piece of law? Primarily from the standpoint that it memorializes relationships that had already existed, but it really puts them into a legal construct of some kind. As financial advisors, we've now been labeled municipal advisors, not to be confused with a personal financial advisor, which we've been called all kinds of things: bond counsel, financial advisor, accountant, you name it. We've been called everything under the sun, but now we're municipal advisors, and it really clarifies whose interests are represented throughout a debt transaction. We'll talk about the players here in just a second. Another thing it's going to force us to do along with you is really formalize our relationship in some fashion. For most of the clients I think Sean and I work with, it's actually pretty rare to have a contract in place. We certainly communicate the scope of our services, the fees involved, all those things, but we've, for good or bad, been able to work along throughout time without formal contracts in place. At this point, that is not going to be reality any longer, and those will have to be taken into account, whether any of us like that or not. But it's probably best in any case so that everything is spelled out, and transparency is really the key word throughout this piece of legislation. Moving on to the next slide here. Primary reason that you would want to care about this law is it really recognizes the conflict that exists when you have somebody who's giving you advice as an issuer of debt, who also then wants to take that hat off as your so-called advisor and then sit across the table from you and potentially negotiate that transaction. Now, whether that's a bank or an investment banker working under the scope of a broker-dealer firm, that's what this is getting at. So it's really trying to clarify the role of the lender or the purchaser of your debt. And when I say purchaser of your debt, I want you to think of we'll talk here in a second about what an underwriter is, but think about a securities dealer, the Morgan Stanleys, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs. That's kind of what I want you to think about when you're thinking about a securities firm. they're not, they're like the Costco's of the securities business. They want people to buy financial products, but in order to originate the products, they have to have somebody issue them. So if you think about it from the standpoint of a broker in a real estate transaction, really at some point potentially representing both sides of the transaction. Now, as the person listing your house, you may not necessarily want that, right? Because you want somebody to represent your interest and maybe your interest exclusively, whereas in potential situations, you may have one party ultimately trying to balance between representing both parties in the transaction. Okay, so that's where you get the dealers who have a conflict in this, who are trying to give you advice on the one hand, but also trying to represent the best interests of the ultimate investor. They're not buying it necessarily for their own account, they're buying it with an eye towards distribution. Then to kind of look forward here on the next slide, but also take a step back from the standpoint of who typically gets involved in the issuance of municipal debt. You have yourselves as issuers. You're the ones that are using your statutory authority to issue debt obligations.
I don't know if that's on.
Yep, it's on.
Maybe.
Talk louder.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you back.
Okay, gotcha.
Sorry.
Usually that's not a problem, so yeah, I'll hold it up closer here as well. You have, you as the issuer, obviously, issuing the debt. You have a bond approving attorney, which is really a special attorney, but I'm sure if you ask Tom, all attorneys are special in their own regard. But this is an attorney who has special expertise in the area of debt issuance. They understand tax law. I won't get into the details of tax-exempt debt, but they're really providing an opinion for the benefit of both parties to the transaction, that this is a legal, valid, and binding obligation of the issuer. In the case of tax-exempt debt, that it's free from federal income taxation, in some cases state income taxation as well. But you're paying them for this opinion, right, as the issuer, but it's benefiting all parties to the transaction. You have ourselves, in some instances, as financial or municipal advisor. They're helping the issuer understand the finance plan, work through everything associated with that, thinking about how to sell your obligations or find a market for them. In certain instances, we do it just like you would do a construction project. We package up the whole thing, and then we put it out to public bid. We allow the market to work for you. Just like the lending tree commercial when banks compete you win, same concept in that regard. Or we may just find a local bank to work with if that's your desire, or one particular buyer for your securities as well. You have the underwriter. In this case, we're talking about the securities market. They are the initial purchaser of these securities, but they're buying them with the notion that they're going to distribute them to investors. So you as an issuer, you could go out and find 50 different people to buy your bonds, or you could go to one party to buy them and then distribute them as individual investments to the ultimate holders of that. Now in the case of the underwriter, they can also have people under their umbrella who act as advisors as well. I would call them investment bankers. They call themselves a lot of times financial advisors, so that's where the lines get blurred, right? That's what the purpose of this legislation is really for, is to make it clear to you as the issuer who is being represented here. So in some cases, they serve both roles, all right? So you can understand that when you have somebody who's buying your debt and also giving you advice, there is an inherent conflict to that. I won't go into the placement agent, but certainly dealers act in regard to find a particular purchaser like a bank to buy your debt in some cases, but that's not that's not the norm in the case of municipal obligations. On slide 5 here, the bullet point I'll really I'll point you to is the second one, in that the Dodd-Frank legislation establishes a fiduciary duty for the relationship between the municipal advisor and the issuer. Now, in our capacity, we've always felt that obligation, that we represent our clients first and foremost, our own interests second. But again, this codifies that relationship and puts it into law. So not only do we feel we're required, but now the law says we're required to put your interests first. Secondarily, this is really the first piece of legislation that in some fashion or another tries to protect the issuer of municipal securities at the federal level anyways. All right. There's some further depth within the legislation that really tries to define what a municipal advisor is. Really, it comes down to any entity or individual that is providing advice to any of you as municipal entities with respect to the issuance of municipal obligations or utilization of other financial products. And when you're seeing here things like structure, timing of issues, things like when should we go into the market? Is this a good time for us? Should we wait? What are really our options? Structure is more about, what's the ultimate repayment schedule on the debt? How's it going to look? What are the prepayment features? That gets into some of the terms and conditions as well. What kind of security should we offer? Should we issue general obligation debt? Tom kind of talked about general funds and utility funds. Should we issue revenue bonds that are secured by utility revenues? What are our options? What's best for us? So anybody giving you advice then in that regard would be deemed a municipal advisor. And there was some piece of time where officials that were sitting on governing bodies that were not elected or municipal staff were even going to get wrapped up in this, but that has since passed, thankfully. So slide 7 here, in terms of individuals that you would work with as municipal advisors, certainly ourselves, and I won't get into the third bullet there in terms of what is included. There's also solicitors or people that basically go out and find business, right? They're not necessarily the technical side, but they know people. They can rub shoulders and high five and get you to feel good about doing business with a particular firm. Not included in that list were the broker-dealers of the world, those that are serving as underwriters, and then also other professionals that you rely on for advice but are acting in the capacity of their particular scope of expertise. All right, so attorneys that are offering legal advice, engineers providing engineering advice, but I think we probably all work with a few that sometimes offer some advice outside of that scope because they have particular expertise. But this law is really going to compartmentalize the ability for different professionals to offer different areas of advice without slipping into this municipal advisor boundary. And why is that? Is because on page 8 you can see that anybody who wishes to be a municipal advisor now has to register with 2 separate organizations, one at the federal level, temporarily anyways, with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which we have done, as well as a group called the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, which is more of a self-regulatory organization made up of banks, securities firms, the public in terms of issuing entities have representation on that group, and as well as the financial advisors have some representation there as well. But it's really dominated by banks and securities firms. So that group promulgates the rules within which the municipal market really operates. And again, I won't bore you with those, but they are important from the standpoint of how the dealer community operates amongst not only itself, but with all of you, and that we get wrapped up in that as well. We'll talk about one of those particular rules here in a second. Slide 9 shouldn't come as any big shake in terms of what's prohibited. These are things that certainly individual firms have policies towards. We've gone to the level of banning any sort of political contributions at all, simply because that's our clientele, and if we're giving contributions, then we could potentially be buying influence to some extent. And certainly at the state level, different states have different prohibitions on gifts, entertainment, those kind of things. So these are not overly restrictive. They're really just common sense in that regard. So things that we all have to watch out for. In terms of slide 10 here, again, importance of really memorializing this fiduciary duty that a municipal advisor would owe to its client. And again, this is something that we have always practiced, but don't think of it any less than, say, an attorney or anybody else that's representing you in a fashion where they're in a position of trust, where you're relying on their advice. The fiduciary aspect comes that we should put your interest before our own. But there's always a built-in conflict whenever you have a fee-based service. You want to get paid, of course. Everybody wants to get paid, so you have to balance that with the duties of loyalty and care. So again, you want to have a clear contract, spell out the role and relationships of everybody, and you want to have disclosure. So if we have multiple service lines, a good example will be a law firm. You may have somebody representing you from a legal firm that has different lines of business, right? And they have somebody come into town and say, oh, well, our real estate attorneys represent this individual. We want to disclose that to you. Are you okay with that? If you're not, then we'll find another firm to represent you in this transaction. So if those things are needed, that's what this is all about. Disclosure to you of both the fees, any other conflicts that may exist, and then for us, doing our own due diligence and making sure we're offering the proper advice relative to the situation at hand. Last couple slides here, really want to touch on how it changed the role of the underwriter in municipal securities transactions. Again, this is the primary purchaser of your debt, the dealer that expects to then turn around and sell it to investors. Again, I touched on the fact that it was the case that there were employees of these firms that acted in the capacity of financial advisors. Again, okay, so they had their advice hat on, and then they'd say, okay, now I'm no longer your financial advisor, I'm resigning from that role, and now you're going to negotiate with me directly for us to buy your bonds, all right? So now at the most important time of the whole transaction, you've done all this important planning, but now when it comes down to it, now you don't have any representation any longer. Now you're entering into an arm's length transaction with a firm that is directly going to be compensated from how much they pay you for your bonds and what the interest rates are attached to that. You're dealing from a situation of information asymmetry. They know more about this than you do. And now when you most need the help, they've walked to the other side of the table. After they've gotten all your dirty secrets, they know you've started your project, you need the money. Well, what are you going to say at that point if they bring you a deal that maybe you're not totally comfortable with? And it's typically an area where elected officials already don't have a lot of comfort. They don't have the knowledge to ask the questions necessarily that need to be asked. So you get put in a vulnerable position. Well, Rule G23, we won't go through the dozens of G rules, but this one basically says can't do that anymore. No longer are you able to both be a financial advisor and an underwriter on the same transaction. You can do one or the other, but not both. All right, so you need to decide your roles in advance, and you have to disclose to the issuer specifically that you're not their buddy. Even though you might be a nice guy, at the end of the day, this is you and I engaging in a transaction in which I benefit to the extent that you lose. Right? This is a zero-sum game to some extent. Go ahead.
Does that mean the firm or the individual doing the support to advise you to do it? Now, he can't become the one who sells you the bond. Does that mean the company or just the individual?
Well, the individual is an agent of the company, so in effect they are one and the same at that point in the transaction. So again, even though this may be a nice person and they can manage this conflict, there's too many people that can't. So at this point in the game, the federal government has stepped in and said, no longer can this be the case. You need to have distinct roles.
Does that apply with refinancing as well?
It makes no difference what the money is used for, what the purpose of the financing is. The relationship has to be spelled out specifically at the beginning of the engagement. So in the case of state law, there are state laws in Wisconsin. If you want to go sell bonds or anything that has an initial term greater than 10 years, that it has to go to public sale, which means competitive bidding. There is an exception to that rule that says if you're doing refunding bonds, you don't have to do that. You can negotiate them directly. So some firms have taken the tack to do things that allow them to sidestep those rules. Okay, even if that is allowed under state law, that would no longer be allowed under federal law. You can't do that anymore.
That would be the case with negotiated bonds.
Correct. So any particular transaction, if you're getting advice from a person who is representing a broker-dealer firm, they are precluded from buying your bonds under exclusive negotiation, and even if they go to competitive sale, they can't place a bid on your bonds. So you have to be very careful who you're relying on for advice, and you should expect them to disclose all of that information to you, regardless if, for us as an independent, you don't have to worry about that. If you're dealing with a firm that's not independent, that is a securities firm, they have to disclose to you the ramifications of working with them as a financial advisor, that they can no longer bid at public sale and they can't negotiate the transaction with you. So you've basically precluded one party from buying your bonds when maybe you want them to be bidding on your bonds. So as far, so we got into the what does this mean for you as an issuer. That's a perfect example of what that means. There's still some things in play in terms of definitions. They're not entirely clear. They're still subject to finalization at this point, and that's really in the area of what is a municipal advisor. A lot of other professionals are being kind of swept up in that. We do need some clear definitions in terms of who is and who is not, and at what point does that potentially change. Again, we've got the clear rules on what the underwriter's interest is in a transaction and who they really represent at the end of the day. If we come on to the next couple slides here, there is already a body out there that promulgates best practices in the area of debt issuance, and that's the Government Finance Officers Association. They've been saying all along the things that are basically in law now. I shouldn't say all along. I'd say in the last 3 or 4 years, they've really gotten stronger on the language in terms of there is an inherent conflict between from getting advice from someone who also wants to buy your bonds versus there is a potential conflict, which is what they used to say. They've moved into there is absolutely an inherent conflict built into that relationship that you just cannot get out of in any way under any kind of contract. You can't break free of that. So if you're following their best practices, you're certainly doing the right thing. And if you're already working with an independent advisor, which certainly some in this room are, that practice should continue to serve you well. All right. So from the standpoint of those of you who go back to an elected body, you should help them understand some of these issues. You have to certainly maybe educate yourself a little more than what you're seeing here. But at the end of the day, it's really about protecting your own interests and understanding who represents who in a transaction. Those are all great questions. Thank you for asking those. If there's any more, I'll answer them now. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Sean, and he'll step into the financing of capital projects discussion.
Where we're going to move to at this point is looking at the approach we would recommend when a community is looking at financing a capital project. And we're really going to focus on the work in this discussion that goes on at the front end of that decision. Not so much and I would put these two parts on an equal basis. The planning, the education, the discussion about a particular capital project that you as representatives of a municipality are bringing forward, and going through that, discussing it, getting information out, is just as important as the second part, a lot of which Brian was just discussing, where you're at the point of now we know what we're going to do, and we're going to go get the money to do it. We're going to do a bond sale, we're going to get the dollars so that we can implement the plan that we have. So in looking at that first part, the financing of capital projects, we've broken it down into a couple different sections. First, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the current environment that we're in and some of the challenges that it poses for a community looking to deal with a capital need and a capital project. Secondly, in terms of building up the background and information that you can use in discussing with your constituents, we're going to spend some time talking about some recommendations on assessing your needs, not just immediate, but looking on a little more longer time horizon, as well as some resources that may be available to you to help assist in the financing. And then also taking a step back before you move forward in assessing the overall financial situation of your community. How do we look now? What are some strengths? What are some vulnerabilities? And spending a little time on that before you move forward. From there, once you've got this information available, we want to talk a little bit about what some approaches for educating and engaging the constituents, the public, in the project that you're looking at. How can we do that? How can we make that most effective so it doesn't end up in a situation of it's the elected officials and the staff's project against the public, but more trying to make it more broad-based. It's not always going to work, and not everybody's going to agree. There's going to be some discomfort there. There always is. But at least you're on the side of the community. You're making all efforts possible to do what you can to help everybody understand why we're considering this option, why we think it needs to be done. And really, in the last set of that, you're presenting different options, and you're discussing the pros and the cons of those options. So that's what I'll be going over the next 15, 20 minutes here. So again, just like with the discussion that Brian was heading up, if there's any questions as we move along, feel free to interrupt me and we'll take those right away. Okay, I'm on, just so we're all together, I'm on page 18 of the handout that's in your packets. One of the biggest challenges that I'm sure all of you are aware of right now for looking at financing projects and just dealing with your budgets in general is the levy limits that are outstanding right now. Not only is it a challenge in managing the levy limits, in many cases it's a challenge in understanding the levy limits. But big picture right now, the levy limits restrict you to increasing your levy to 0% or the net new construction of the community. And in the current market environment, the current overall economy, the 0% comes into play all too often. The other change that as levy limits have been in place in Wisconsin is for a while, initially, you either had to use the capacity available to you or you lost it. Then that law was changed to allow you to bank capacity, with potentially as an option banking it for a capital project that could be coming up that you wanted to pay cash for. Now we're back to use it or lose it. So that with the last, I think it was the last go around, we're back into that situation, and I think that's where we're going to be moving forward. So that poses a challenge as well. Another item I know that you're all very aware of is your budgets. Many of the issues, a big portion of them, are dominated by personnel costs. And so that makes decisions on adjustments with those even all the more difficult. Now, some of the things that we've seen come out of that, and what I would categorize in some cases as unintended consequences of levy limits, is operating budgets, which historically would include your operating costs for personnel, the cost to keep the lights on in the building, benefits. Those costs, as they've increased, they have had the effect of forcing cuts in the capital area that you would have been budgeting for either for a future capital project or for capital projects that occur in a particular year. As we've looked around with the clients that we work with, more and more capital budgeting to pay cash for projects, either setting it aside for a future project or using it in a particular year, that's getting shrunk. And it's really, the issue is that you've got this levy limit, you got to make a choice. Are you going to cut the personnel side, or are you going to make an adjustment on the capital side? And what we've seen generally, it's the capital side that ends up getting shrunk. So that's removed in many cases, not all, but in many cases, communities that their practice, which we've always encouraged, of levying cash for particularly shorter-lived capital assets has gotten squeezed out in many cases. What supplemented that? Debt financing for capital projects that even have very short useful lives. And the reason for that is one exception to levy limits is general obligation debt. The issuance of general obligation debt and the payments that you have to make to pay that debt back is outside of the levy limits. You can increase the levy for that purpose. One last stress that we've seen is on fund balance. Another option when posed with the question of making some of these cuts or adjustments is, and Tom talked about this in the session before, you look at that fund balance that the city has or the village has or the town has, and maybe you go to that to assist in a particular year. Short term, that can be a solution that can work. Long term, it leads to a whole lot of other problems. I think Tom even alluded to where that could be a problem down the road. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to shift then to where we'd recommend step one if you were dealing with a particular capital project and looking at the need to get that project done in your community. And this is now on page 20. And that is spending some time up front developing a capital asset inventory, doing so for the different departments. So as an example, public safety, public works, fire, any of those different areas. And not just developing a 1-year list, but a 3 to 5 year list. My guess is that many of you either formally or informally are already doing some of this, or your department heads, if you have those, are doing some of this. But when looking at the context particularly of a large capital project, so something like a town hall, village hall, fire hall, maybe a large street improvement, you're going to want to have that list in mind, really with the idea of keeping all the activities that you've got needs for in mind when looking at a particular project. Now, once you've got that list, a couple things that we think you should do to refine it. One would be to prioritize it. Just getting the list together, but not really ranking it in terms of what's most important, what you believe the highest needs are, doesn't really get the full job done. So certainly you want to take that step. We would certainly also recommend putting it into categories that break it down into projects that are probably have a shorter useful life, maybe 5 years or less, and the projects that have long useful lives. Water, sewer, utility improvements, streets can have a much longer life, facility improvements. And lastly, if you've got sewer and water utilities, electric utilities, breaking down the capital projects into those that fall into that category with the expectation that they're going to be funded with revenues from those funds. I think Tom talked about those, the business funds or the proprietary funds from the general fund, and having a clear delineation between the two. Now, when you're looking at those lists of those capital assets that you've got needs for in the future, also look at what are some of the resources available to you. And this could be in the form of grants, low-interest loans, different options that you've got for a particular project. And a lot of times you're going to get assistance with this, and you should ask for assistance from this from professionals you work with, engineers, planners, financial advisors, municipal advisors, as we're going to be called at this point. Another area is looking at your cash reserves, and I'll get into this a little bit more detail. Some of it dovetails into what Tom talked about, fund balances in a second. But understanding if you've already been setting aside monies for a particular capital project, or if you've got a stream of revenue that is currently coming in and that you expect to continue to come in for some time. All right, from there, and at this point I'm on page 22 of the handout, really taking a look at where your community sits and developing a financial baseline for this. We recommend that you look at things in a 3 to 5 year window, and that you look at it holistically. So you're looking at what is our operating budget. So a lot of that's personnel benefits and salaries that fall into that category, but also includes the cost to keep your facilities moving, cost to plow the streets, all those types of expenses that you have. Look forward when you're looking at developing this financial baseline, and take into account changes that you see coming up. Are we going to need to add additional personnel because there's potentially growth going on in the community? Are we opening a new facility that's going to have new operating costs for that facility to be open? Want to include that, and really looking at both of these things, as I'd mentioned, in a multi-year period, not just a year-to-year period. Also, as a part of this financial baseline, you're going to want to take a stock in an inventory of your current debt situation. Now, does everybody here have outstanding debt of some kind for your community? Is there anybody that doesn't have any debt outstanding? It does happen. Got one. If you've got debt, and most communities are going to have debt constantly throughout the time that they're a community, understand what types of debt you have. I think when Tom was going through his presentation, he showed a slide where the audit broke out what of your debt was general obligation, what of your debt maybe is supported by water, sewer, utilities, so those other funds. Understand that, and with that, understand what the repayment of it is. Most times with utility debt, it's going to be water, sewer, electric, maybe stormwater that's paying that back. But particularly focus in on your general obligation debt, because not all of that is always repaid by taxes. You as issuers, when you issue GO debt, you have backed it up with a pledge that you will levy taxes if need be. But in many, many cases, a GO issue is sometimes supported by some utility revenues, If you have tax increment financing districts, maybe is supported by some of those revenues. So again, in getting this inventory of what your debt is like right now, you're going to want to take a look at what are those revenue sources that you're using to pay back that debt. The terms and conditions of the debt, paying particular attention to, is the debt prepayable at this time? Or if you have a balloon payment, it's a little more rare in the current environment, but I know when I started as a financial advisor 15 to 17 years ago, a lot of communities had debt that was out over 10 years and had a balloon payment at the end of it that was going to have to be extended. So understanding that, understanding where the debt is at, and then lastly, understanding the structure of the debt. I think Brian talked about a little bit that in terms of getting advice for structure of debt. One thing that we do all the time as financial advisors / municipal advisors is we'll review the community's individual debt issue by issue, and then we'll put it all together in an aggregate form, really looking for, is the debt flat payments, say over a 5 to 10 year, up to a 20-year payment, or are there some opportunities where the debt drops off? An example of that would be if you had a facility financing, let's say it was a library, and you've been paying on that debt for 15 years. Originally you did it for 17 years. You got 2 more years worth of payments. Maybe when that is paid off, you have a built-in decrease in your debt levy. How that pertains to looking at a new capital project is maybe it makes a lot of sense to time that additional project, bringing that additional project online, at the same time the other one goes away. That's an opportunity that if you've gotten, and there's a number of communities around here. As an example, over in River Falls, their City Hall project was added in right as they had a major drop in the debt. Still a very expensive project, still has to get paid for, but instead of having a major spike up in the year that that debt came online, it's very smooth. Now, if you didn't do the project, one can argue that the debt would have dropped significantly and that payment would go away, and that's certainly a good argument. But if I'm a taxpayer and I feel like this project eventually is going to get done, it's got to get done, I'd much rather have it go at a time where maybe some other projects have fallen off so that the impact on my individual taxes is really pretty minimal. So those kind of opportunities, it's worthwhile at the front end of a capital project and the study behind what makes the most sense for our particular community to take a look at those issues. Okay, now the next couple slides, I'll go into these pretty briefly. Tom did allude to a lot of this. One is that you're going to want to spend some time looking at your fund balances. One of the questions I work over in Baldwin, as well as Tom, since they do have that very strong fund balance, they've considered doing internal financing, where they will use some of the cash that they have to pay for a project. And in particular, the recommendations as we flush that out is they do it for projects that are going to be paid back with tax increment revenue. So it's really a temporary investment for them. They use the cash, they charge it to the Tiff fund, and the Tiff pays that back. So that fund balance eventually comes back to them. In other situations, sometimes it makes sense if your fund balance has grown to a level that's very strong, to take that cash and use it for a one-time larger capital project. One area though you're going to want to be cautious about this, and this is more over on page 24, and this is something that Tom also alluded to, is once you've done that, let's say you have a $2 million fund balance and you drop it to $1.5 million, your ability to get that back up to $2 million, unless you have a Tiff fund that could actually pay for that project, it's gone. And your ability to get that cash back could be very difficult. Yep.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do TIF district funds have to be spent in the TIF district itself, or can you take TIF district funds and spend them someplace outside of the TIF district?
I'm going to get...
That's another seminar, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a whole other seminar. Yeah, Let me give you a couple of scenarios. The short answer is there are ways to use TIF revenue to pay for projects outside of the boundaries of the TIF. I would put it into two categories. One is project costs that benefit the TIF, but because of their nature, maybe a sewer or water line, they don't necessarily have to be within the boundaries because you're going to build it wherever it starts and it's going to come there eventually. So that's one category. The other change in the rule 3-4 years ago? 2008. There's a change now that when you do a tax increment plan, or you could amend your plan to allow for TIF revenues to be used for projects that are within a half mile of the boundaries of the TIF. When you use that particular provision, there doesn't have to be quite that direct link to the benefit to the TIF of using those monies. But the one thing I would mention to you, Al, if you were to consider using that, if you don't have that in your original plan, you've got to amend your TIF plan to do that, and you're going to have to talk to all your taxing jurisdictions in that joint review board format to do that.
How often can you do the amendment to get, who will do an amendment? Is it just one time to amend, if you want to amend outside of the TIF?
To
Do an amendment to include something, is that just a one time?
Yeah, if you do a boundary amendment to add area to your tax increment district, you can do that up to 4 times during the life. The half-mile projects, that's considered a project plan amendment. You can do as many of those as you want. Yep.
There is one caution that I learned in the city I'm administrator for. We lowered our principal in our cash reserves to do a project and actually buy some property. But the unanticipated consequence of that was when we used that principal in our cash fund, we lowered the principal, and so our investments dropped as well. And it was fairly significant. I think it was an unintended consequence of using cash.
So the investment income off of that fund balance that you had built into your budget now wasn't a revenue stream for the budget going forward. No, that's a. I don't think we should. That should be noted, shouldn't we? We should probably have that in there.
Yeah,
but
also if you buy property, you take it off tax rolls in
you
certain
pretend-
cases as well. So
right.
Yep.
Yep. And Tom alluded to that cash flow throughout the year, and that you kind of have that trough generally in the summer. We would recommend, I think many auditors recommend, at a minimum having 3 to 4% or 3 to 4 months, excuse me, of your expenses throughout the year in that fund balance to be able to carry you through that. Sometimes having more makes more sense for other communities. And also, again, because of levy limits, your ability to build that fund back up within your general fund levy, very, very difficult right now, almost unheard of currently.
I've got one more question.
Sure.
You talked a little bit about stormwater utilities and sewer utilities, water utilities. And I've only been in Wisconsin for 6 months, and I came from Minnesota where there are other utilities allowed. And I was wondering if a street-light utility is illegal in Wisconsin. And there was discussion in Minnesota, I don't think the legislation passed, but a street district, what is that?
Like a wheel tax?
Not a wheel tax, a street improvement district. So
Okay.
you identify districts within your city where you know streets need to be repaired, and you start collecting money from the property owners in that district, and as a fund for the time when you can take on that project.
I'm trying to think. I know we had as a session more of the wheel tax idea or the street,
There's no limitations on the utility
Right.
component, but
as long as it's a revenue
in
source.
Wisconsin,
Yep.
Constitutionally, everybody has to pay the same taxes unless you're in like a business improvement district,
Yep.
something like that. So I think the street improvement district probably be a difficult one to accomplish, but that's probably a question for
Mr. Schumacher back there, yeah.
At some point. So, but you can do all kinds of stuff with the dedicated fee, utility type.
Yep. And we've seen that accomplished sometimes with special assessments too, with benefiting from a particular street activity as another strategy to deal with that. But we're certainly seeing more and more of that creativity going on, again, as another reaction to the limitations that levy limits have added. Right, right. Anything else? Okay. What are we going to here too, Tom?
You're about up. You're just about done.
Right at the end? Okay, all right. Well, I'll just real briefly then, the last part we wanted to highlight was that engaging of the public. And it can be accomplished a number of different ways, but spending time so they understand the problem, the different solutions that you think are worthy of further discussion. Oftentimes you're going to get that question, well, why didn't we just save money for this so that we could do it now? Why don't we start saving so we could do it later? Talking about why is that possible or not possible? And spending time on that overall current financial situation so they understand what you're dealing with as you look at a particular project and how it might be able to get done. If you can set up newsletters, and I know this takes time out of already busy schedules, also have open houses, workshops for those kind of purposes, to, again, with the ideal of engaging and also educating the public. I think that pays a lot of dividends in terms of trying to get these types of projects done. And certainly don't hesitate to let them know, not in a way that's dealing with the minutia, because I think that just gets you into all kinds of things you don't want, but big picture wise, here's what our financial situation for our community is. You can look to people like us, your auditors, and other folks that other professionals to help you out in kind of packaging that together in a way that can be discussed with the public so they can understand what it is you're wrestling with as you're trying to deal with these projects. And lastly, I think just to sum it up, doing that and taking that time will really allow you, I think, to get a broader consensus about the need for a particular project and to get you more build in. Again, never expect 100% because that's not going to be likely. There's always going to be those that think this isn't a good idea, and they may have good reasons for that opinion. But the more you can do at the front end, lay everything out, the easier when you actually get to the point of doing the financing and dealing with the situation that Brian was talking about, the better off and the easier that final step is going to be. All right. So great. I apologize we ran a little long, and we are certainly here going to stick around for a little bit yet. If there's questions on that refinancing of your debt, we didn't get to that, but we're certainly willing to hang out if anybody has questions about that.